So thanks very much for your time. It's a very interesting report that you've released today on the need for industrial policy in Africa. And I just wanted you to just reflect on what the report says about the failures of manufacturing currently in Africa and the poor performance, as well as why we need to pursue as Africans a deliberate industrial policy.
So first of all, thank you for asking the question. As I said, Africa is still marginalized today in terms of the global manufacturing market. Its size of that market is only about 1.1%, so it just tells you that there is a long path ahead if Africa wants to be recognized as one of the major players on that market. In terms of what needs to be done, the report is advocating that industrial development will not happen without an industrial policy in specific countries, and industrial policy has to be designed by the government, but in coordination, in partnership and in consultation with all stakeholders, and primarily of course with the private sector. The importance of designing that industrial policies, I think we've seen from mistakes of the past that simply relying on the market to do the right thing will not help. And this in itself, when you look at the data over 3 or 4 decades of industrial performance in Africa, you can actually see that in many countries the period where there was no government involvement or liberalization but without proper direction has been characterized by deindustrialization. So even the achievements that were there in the past, meaning in some cases in the 1970s, where you could see a small but burgeoning manufacturing sector in some countries, these achievements have been lost. So we're saying industrial policy is necessary, and industrial policy has to be done with all stakeholders.
And given the failures of past industrial policy experiments, not only in Africa but elsewhere, lessons have been learned, and some of the best practices are sort of presented in this report, putting limits, having transparency, involving the private sector. Can you take us through some of those best practices?
Yes, basically, although the report does not want to be prescriptive, we do not want to say that what needs to be done for specific countries, because we believe that governments and their constituencies are better placed, unless we're asked to do the job, to get into the nitty-gritty of what needs to be done. We've identified a number of key principles that we believe, considering the evidence of past failures for industrialization in Africa, and also considering what's been done elsewhere, learning from what's been done elsewhere that worked, as well as learning from failures. Some of these principles are: one, first of all, like really commit to industrialization to happen. The second one is that elaborate an industrial policy document that really clearly identifies what are the sectors to be prioritized, if such sectors are already in place, support these specific sectors, or in some cases there would be specific firms, but give time limit to that support, because that's been done in the past. But what actually the problem was that domestic firms were supported in some cases, but without any sunset clause, so to speak, without any I would say any specific requirements for results. And what we've seen is that although in some cases they've been able to cater for the domestic market, they have failed to be competitive on the international scene, because they were operating in a context of totally artificial competition. And then if I were to single out some of the key aspects as well, I'm going to finish with one, which is, as I said, and I want to insist on this, the report is saying that the process is as important as the implementation phase, and that process should be inclusive for the resulting industrial policy to be actually able to rally all key actors around it, the process has to be done in the right way. Transparency is key, because one of the reasons, again, why past policies have failed is that when governments went into the business of picking winners, it was not clear on what basis. So, of course, there is always the suspicion, and the evidence afterwards showing that this selection was based on pressure from specific lobby groups that might not have been the right ones to support in the first place. So that's why I'm insisting on the transparency in the process. But implementation is also key, and that implementation should actually be done over a time period where monitoring and evaluation become an integral, an important part, with the idea of a feedback loop. So it's a cycle. The lessons learned through experimentation in some cases have to feed into the next cycle. So it's not saying that an industrial policy is the answer for all problems of the industrial sectors. Countries can make mistakes. The business sector can make mistakes. It's all about experimentation, trial and error, but learning from those mistakes fast enough to be able to compete in a more efficient way when the next cycle comes around.
And finally, two constraints that you did raise was there's a global trading system that we operate within, as well as we in a commodity-rich environment in Africa. We tend to have overvalued currencies during periods of commodity price boom. In your report and in your analysis, dealing with that, is there enough space to pursue industrial policy action plans in the context of the global trading system and the new rules emerging? And how do you deal with the overvalued currency, which tends to undermine the competitiveness of nascent manufacturers?
Yes, we actually, the report is called Fostering Industrial Development in the New Global Environment, because we wanted to emphasize the restrictions that exist in the current global environment. These restrictions are mostly to do with the multilateral trading system, emerging constraints that are part of the NAMAs, EPAs and TRIPS and TRIMS, and a whole range of constraints that ultimately, if finalized, would actually result in a smaller policy space for countries. And we're saying that this is not fair, that most developed countries have managed to get to the point where they are actually at right now because they were able to put in place policies, tariff policies, subsidies when needed, that benefited their own domestic firms and allowed them to compete and nurture them before they actually could open up to international competition. So what we were saying as well as the report is that these threats are there, like tariff policy, for example. In most countries they cannot put in place, design them in the same way that they did in the past. But one has to remember that many of these negotiations have not been finalized yet. So there is still room for African countries to be assertive and to say no when needed. And I think we've seen with the number of EPAs in the region that many countries have put their foot down, not just nationally but also regionally, and saying no, we want to negotiate what goes into these agreements, and we want our constraints to be taken into consideration and our needs to be taken into considerations. The other thing I want to say is that LDCs actually benefit from a number of exemptions. So we're not also saying that it's because of these constraints that Africa has not managed to industrialize. I think one has to recognize that there are a lot of opportunities to be seized. LDCs benefit from a number of exemptions, and should they wish to, they can compete and they can actually assert themselves in specific sectors. And of course, finally, it's also about identifying niche sectors where the constraints being put by these rules would not play such a role. So these niche sectors are there. Africa has to really identify particular niches that are to do and specific to Africa, on which nobody else could compete, and build onto this. And I think the extent to which marketing strategies have allowed specific products to become really global just demonstrates that a number of opportunities are out there, and it's up to countries to seize them.